The agenda this week assessed Canada's foreign policy with China, asked if the internet is in danger of becoming the splinternet, and explored how governments nudge students to consider different career paths. The agenda's week in review begins beneath the now empty office towers of the province with the hard-hit small businesses that usually serve them.
Grant, get us started here because you represent the companies and the retailers which really do truly make up this hidden office economy. When you are looking at the retailers and the hospitality industry and the service providers, just let's start with this. How important would you say they are to the overall health of the city's economy?
Very important. If you look at the path, there's 1,200 retail services and storefronts, well over 5,000 people employed. It's a very important driver. If you look at it, what's like right now, clearly the numbers are down. Many people are working from home, as you said. There are a great number of retailers that are open, and there is, clearly traffic on the path. I go down on a regular basis and spend time in the office.
Samantha, pick up the story from there. Is there any sense of what percentage of workers in the office, who are in the office rather, and how many are still working remotely?
So we estimate right now only 2 to 10% of office workers have actually returned to the office. Our team is focused on returning people to the office and reducing and or mitigating the risk of the virus spread. So we've implemented a lot of strategies for clients in Toronto and across Canada to do that, which are a mix of physical interventions and behavioral protocols to make sure that people can operate within their office environment and trust that everybody is doing the best they can do to reduce that risk of spread. However, we are still seeing that reduced rate of return. So while we have produced plans that actually maximize the capacity thus far and still let people be somewhat safe, we still see that reduced rate of return. And I think one of the reasons is the reluctance to take public transportation. We know from the TTC and the study they produced in the summer that ridership was down 86%. So psychologically, I think people aren't prepared to take public transportation, and that greatly affects the downtown population.
Have you been on the subway or streetcar or bus lately?
I have not. However, my son, who's a higher risk taker than me, has taken both, and he said, "Mom, it's perfectly fine."
I was just going to say that. I'm on it all the time. I mean, I'm on the subway quite frequently, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, everybody masks up, and if you don't have one, they'll hand you one as you walk in, and it really looks like, so I guess what I'm getting at here is, the TTC, I don't think, is any longer a good enough explanation for why people aren't coming back, because the TTC seems perfectly safe. In which case, why do you think there's additional reluctance by people to come back? Because 2 to 10% of people back in those buildings is not very much.
Well, we may see it shift as the weather changes. So what I like to say is a Canadian uses any excuse to be outdoors in the summer. So we've had the summer, Canada effect on the office environment. But now that kids have returned to school and we're going to start seeing colder weather, people might slip into the office more. Also, I think that working from home was a bit of a novelty at first, but that's sort of starting to wear thin. We are seeing that people are, there is a productivity loss that's happening now that we didn't see in the summer months. And people are sort of getting wary of Zoom meetings, so they're having Zoom fatigue. So I do think we'll probably start to see an increase. Now, of course, if we're all indoors and we start to see an increase in the virus more so than we are now, then we're going to have that reversal. But let's say I'm positive that in October, November, we'll start to see a bit of an increase downtown. And then we'll see what happens, of course, if people aren't behaving and we see more of the virus spread. So, of course, that's always the big factor.
Right, gotcha. Joseph, let's tell your story here. Where do you work in the path?
I work at a salon in the Standard Life Center. And I've worked in the TD Center. I've worked at Richmond Adelaide Center.
So right in the heart of the financial district.
Right in the heart of it, yes.
And when business is normal, in other words, when there's not a global pandemic affecting the path and everything else, how's business?
Business is fantastic because if you have 40 floors above you that are full of people and thousands of people walking by your door, you tend to have business. But now we're down 90% at our business.
Well, that certainly jibes with the numbers Samantha just gave us. So are you still going into work?
I've gone from four 10-hour days to 1 3-hour day a week.
Yikes. What's that done to your bottom line?
well, there's no bottom line left, Steve. Like, it's just, it's so I'm doing hair at people's homes. I've become a traveling hairdresser is what I've become.
Do you like that?
Not really my gig, no.
I guess we're going to start with a bit of a focus on the previous government's efforts to create so-called free tuition for lower income people who wanted to go for post-secondary education. And let's just set that up with this clip from the former Deputy Premier, Deb Matthews. Shelton, if you would.
My mandate was clear from the Premier to get better value for the money we were spending. And if there were better ways, different ways of doing things, then it was our job to implement that. We decided that the way we would approach it would be to look at, we called them boulders, groups of programs that had the same goal. And one of the boulders we identified right off the bat was student financial aid. So we forced finance and TCU to actually work together to develop a student aid plan that was way simpler for students and increase participation rates amongst those with the lowest rates.
TCU, of course, being training colleges and universities, one of the ministries involved in this. Okay, Kareem, I want you to take us behind the scenes and talk to us about how difficult it is when you see all of these, as she calls them, boulders in place, how difficult it is to get numerous members of any government on the same page, agreeing to a policy, and then giving it effect. How does that happen?
That happens with political leadership and with advocacy. That clip really shows the two solitudes there of two different departments that are both responsible for a program, but historically feel their own ownership of those issues. And so what the Premier did and what Minister Matthews did with the support of former student activists who ended up being in government, like Paris Szymanski and Sam Andre, who were in that documentary as well, was to say, can we do this better? Can we sacrifice some of those tax credits that are going more to higher and upper income families and redirect those at no additional cost to lower income families? And that creates the setup, a really virtuous circle where people now start to think, oh, I can access university. If I'm got this message that tuition can be free, it's not just good for if you're in grade 12, but it's good if you're in grade 6, if your family's starting to think about what the prospects of post-secondary are for later on in your life.
Kareem, in your view, was the program successful?
It was absolutely successful. I'll just quote some statistics from the first year of the program. 19% increase in awards for students from low-income families, 34% increase in awards to Indigenous students, 31% increase in awards to mature students. And you can find these statistics in the interactive Dive platform that you're profiling there. So it got more aid to students who needed it. It was more expensive than originally planned for, but that's in part because more people took up the program than were expected, and that was part of the policy goal.
All right, let's get some more feedback. Melissa Landsman, in your view, was the program a success?
Well, so I think there's something that comes from political leadership, but then there's also a political reality of when this program was introduced, probably at the end of a mandate of a government that had sort of lost the confidence of Ontarians on issues of affordability and was seen to be spending money for the sake of spending money. So Kareem did mention that the program was oversubscribed and it ballooned to the potential of $2.7 billion by next year if it had happened. And so I think that overall the setup for the program, the communications, the implementation for getting more students to go to school, well, that didn't happen. It redistributed who got the benefit of the taxpayer-funded tuition, rather than actually incentivizing more people to seek out post-secondary education.
Simone, you want to break the tie on this?
I think, of course, in some ways they're both right. Did it work overall? If I really had to come down on one side or the other, I would say no, it did not work in the way that we really wanted to see increased enrollment of those groups. But I think the way that it worked is around communication, and I don't think that we should underestimate that. Was it too expensive? Yes. Did it get the whole province? Did it get all of Canada talking about a discussion about what do we need to make sure that students, that the groups that Kareem mentioned, Indigenous students, mature students, what do they need, not just to get into school, but to actually stay in post-secondary?
I think there is obviously a debate taking place in government, outside of government, like a similar debate is taking place within many of our the political systems of our allies in Europe. The attitudes towards China are changing very rapidly, but I think that the Canadian public on this both recognizes China as hostile and untrustworthy, and but does not want to cut off trade with China, doesn't want to sever economic relations, and doesn't want an escalating dispute. And so it's managing how to push back against China without risking an escalation that would end up hurting Canada more, and trying to do that working with our allies who are themselves trying to readjust their positions towards China. I think that's the bigger story about what's happening here, even in Canada.
Okay, understood. As promised now, Sherry, I'd like to get you into the conversation. Just by way of background, you're from Hong Kong. You're a pro-democracy activist from there. We should point out that earlier this year, in July, Canada suspended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong as part of a package of responses to the imposition of that new security law that China has imposed on Hong Kong. What does all of that say to you about the state of Canada's relationship with Hong Kong today?
I think Canada has taken an important step in supporting Hong Kongers, but also in standing up against the authoritarian agenda of Beijing. But realistically, the extradition treaty, while suspended, Hong Kong Canadians are still at risk. We have seen China use their diplomatic relations with other countries to extradite Canadians, and other Canadians are being arbitrarily detained in China. I want to draw the case of Hussein Jalil, who's a Uyghur Canadian who's been detained since 2007. We have other Chinese Canadians who are unnamed, detained in China and denied consular access. So I think while it's a first step, I think the lack of a strategic framework in approaching China is the flaw that Canada is dealing with right now.
Well, let me follow up on that with something that was reported in the New York Times just a few days ago, and it goes like this. Foreign governments should not benchmark what happens in Hong Kong against standards that prevail in Western countries. Those are governed by a political system entirely different from China's. Instead, they should benchmark Hong Kong against the rest of China and measure how the city can maintain its unique characteristics: openness, a commitment to personal rights and freedoms, respect for the rule of law, and the ability to reinvent itself economically. Beijing's national security law is saving, quote, one country, two systems, by ensuring that Hong Kong does not become a danger to China. And come on back in here. This piece makes it clear that China will call the shots, and there's very little that Western countries can do about it. For better or worse, is the author of that piece right?
Well, China sees this as opportunism. There's no doubt about that. But it also, I think, not just demonstrates a sense of powerlessness amongst the West, but it also demonstrates a lack of knowledge on how the West can move forward in influencing and engaging with China on these issues. We need to understand China's strategic goals much better, and the foundation, political culture, quest for economic supremacy, military and security intent, Belt and Road objectives, much, much better than we do already. China will always flex its muscles and exercise its national sovereignty in its own neighborhood. So, engaging with them needs to understand that this quest for economic supremacy really requires peace. So not military expansionism, but there is also different conceptions of the individual that China brings. Their pursuit of economic goals is based on so it's a revolutionary economic model, one that we really have troubles identifying with. So it's all about education here and knowledge and ways of navigating through in a way that allows options to open when the irritants are removed. At the moment, we don't have a plan to hit the ground running with pace when those irritants are removed.
David, would you agree with that observation that among people in Canada who ought to be in a position to influence the agenda, there is, according to Anne, a lack of knowledge about China's aims and legitimate aspirations?
If anybody who is responsible for our foreign policy, in particular our foreign policy vis-a-vis China, has a lack of knowledge of how China operates, then I think they should maybe crack open a history book or read media reporting on China over the last 20 years. The problem in Hong Kong is that Canada and other Western countries have been feckless and irresponsible as step by step China dismantled one country, two systems. And the person who wrote that piece in the New York Times, of course, is a member of the pro-China establishment in Hong Kong. So we are complicit in this. We should have learned our lesson long, long ago.
I want to start by just setting up our conversation by reading something that was written almost a quarter century ago by the Electric Frontier Foundation's co-founder, John Perry Barlow. And this is what he called a declaration of the independence of cyberspace. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would, and let's go. Governments of the industrial world, he wrote, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. Okay, Scott, get us started here. That pretty provocative thing was written almost 25 years ago. How would you describe the vision for the internet around this time?
Well, like the French Revolution, what bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. Everything looked as though the single model, as Francis Fukuyama told us, of liberal, open, democratic government, free markets was going to take over the world. And the internet was seen as kind of the, as an electronic, borderless analog of that speech would become free across borders and the power of the state would wither away. So none of that really has happened. And the powers of the state have steadily increased with respect to cyberspace and the World Wide Web. Initially in the 90s, when you started having the ability to, actually participate on the web as a sort of non-geek human being, it was completely dominated by the United States. It was completely dominated by U.S. companies. The real battles for freedom were between the geek community and the United States government, which wanted to control various forms of content like pornography and drug dealing and money laundering. But once those issues were more or less worked out in the 2000s, there seemed to be a relatively open plane of an international platform. Really, it wasn't until the Snowden revelations that governments began to push back really hard against a U.S.-dominated system, although that had been in the cards since the mid-90s. Really, it was a gradual process of kind of the reassertion of state power up to today, when it continues to be asserted ever more.
Eileen, let me repeat one of the quotes in that Barlow piece. You have no sovereignty, he wrote 24 years ago. Have governments around the world listened to that admonition?
No, 24 years later, absolutely not. We've seen, a radical flip of John Perry Barlow's vision. But I do want to say that at the time, he really did capture something important, and I don't want to forget that. He wasn't wrong in those early days, and he was a visionary and a wonderful, genuinely libertarian spirit, and he was very influential on that early community. And he was right in the sense that at that time, the early internet was a challenge to governments for the very simple reason that, the inherent feature, global, transborder, instantaneous communication, is inherently challenging to a model of nation states defined by territorial boundaries And it was challenging to governments at the time. And there was a phase for about a decade of this sense of liberty, and that the early days were that the internet would be beneficiary to civil society actors, human rights activists around the world, and that authoritarian governments would not be able to catch up. That was mistaken, but I will say it, full decade, 2011, the Freedom Online Coalition was formed, which was a coalition of governments supporting this vision of the global open interoperable internet for civil society. 2012 was the first UN resolution on internet freedom, proclaiming this idea that human rights must be protected online as offline. It did come to an end the next year with the Snowden revelations, where there was this sense that democratic governments themselves were not adhering to these principles. And on some level, we've almost never recovered from that moment.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.